So good afternoon and welcome to the 2019 Gertrude M. Cox Award Presentation. I would like to extend a special thanks to NORC for hosting us. A number of years we've been down in my home office at RTI in Washington, D.C., so it's good to branch out a little bit. So Gertrude Cox was a dedicated and award-winning researcher, teacher, and leader in the areas of survey methodology, experimental design, biostatistics, and statistical computing. In 1960, for example, Gertrude Cox became the first head of the Statistical Research Division at the newly founded Research Triangle Institute, now known as RTI, my favorite employer. WSS, the Washington Statistical Society, and RTI first established this award in 2003 with RTI funding the honorarium. We have several representatives from RTI, and you probably know some of those faces in the audience. With us today, including, for example, Dr. Craig Hill, a newly elected fellow of the American Statistical Association. And I love the opportunity to put a little bit of red in Craig's face. So there we go. The Gertrude M. Cox Award recognizes early to mid-career statisticians who have significant contributions, who've made significant contributions in one or more areas in applied statistics. The current winner sets quite an example and needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Courtney Kennedy's resume is too long for me to list all of her accomplishments because ultimately we want to hear her talk, not to hear me talk. So her many accomplishments started even before she obtained her PhD in survey methodology from the University of Michigan in 2010. Her research areas span a variety of issues, for example, measurement error, data collection in telephone surveys, political polling, non-probability sample, as well as bots and other suspect data in online surveys, which will be presented today. Currently, she is the director of survey research for the Pew Research Center, a JPMS short course instructor, and the 2019 APOR conference chair, including a bunch of other things that I will not list. She has numerous publications, invited talks, and awards on this resume, and today we add yet another award to her growing pile, as we say. So with that, I will hand the floor to Dr. Courtney Kennedy, recipient of the 2019 Gertrude M. Cox Award. Yay.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Jill. I appreciate those remarks. Thank you to WSS, to RTI. Thank you all for coming today. And thank you to NORC for hosting this event. This is really a very unexpected, tremendous honor. I'm really in awe of Professor Cox for all the reasons that Jill mentioned, in awe of her many accomplishments and what this award represents. Professor Cox obviously really blazed a trail for generations of future researchers interested in applying statistics and experimental design to learn more about the world. And I consider myself one of the many people who are really in her debt. The work that I'd like to discuss with you today is an applied methodological project. So maybe not something that Professor Cox would have studied exactly in her line of work, but this project does raise some fundamental questions about where do some of today's important statistics come from, and what sorts of processes might be generating those data. So questions that I think Professor Cox would have been interested in. This work is a collaborative effort All of the domestic methodologists at the Pew Research Center are co-collaborators with me on this. So I appreciate their contributions, and I also appreciate the support from the leadership of the Pew Research Center of this project. So one thing I need to say is that we are in the midst of this study. The data collection is complete. We've got a good chunk of the analysis behind us, but we are not yet at the stage where it's final and the report's out and whatnot. So I just want to be clear that this is a preliminary analysis that I'm going to share with you today. Some of the exact estimates and even some of the characterizations of the data may change in subsequent reporting from this study. We will be issuing a public report and making the data set public along with all the codes that I'll be showing you, and that's all forthcoming. Okay. So one of the things we are keenly interested in at Pew Research Center is just the landscape of public opinion research in the United States. We do polls. We're also interested in what other practitioners who do polling are doing in their methods. And if you think about the landscape of public opinion research, there's obviously some key statistics that garner a lot of attention for good reasons. So the president's job approval rating is obviously one of them. But there's others, public opinion about Obamacare or public opinion about the state of the national economy. There's lots of these sort of key estimates that are derived from public opinion polls that get a lot of attention. One thing that I think a lot of people may not be aware of is if you look under the hood of these types of estimates, what do we find? So this is an aggregated estimate of Donald Trump's approval rating based on one of those aggregator websites. And if you look under the hood of what data was feeding into that estimate, on any given day, you may see something exactly like this. I've masked the pollster names, the company names, because that's not our focus. But what I want to point out is that literally all of the polls that are going into a lot of contemporary estimates are based exclusively on online, opt-in, non-probability samples. Now, you might check in on this website and one day it looks like this. A couple of days later, you may very well see, a random digit dial poll in there or a poll based on a sample from a voter file or some sort of address-based recruitment. So it doesn't always look like this, but this is very common, and this is sort of the part of the contemporary landscape of public opinion research. And you can see most of those samples, most of the polling is done with online opt-in survey panels or river samples, something like that. But there's another thing going on. We've noticed in this past election cycle, at least one public opinion pollster is using sampling from a crowdsourced marketplace website. So you have a couple things going on. So if you think about these online opt-in polls, one way to characterize them is sort of on the left here, you have what are by now pretty familiar survey panels, river samples. These are things, survey platforms online that are designed to do surveys or polls or market research, right? That's why they're designed and built, and that's what they're used for. This other thing, crowdsourcing marketplace website, is really designed with something else in mind. It's designed to link up companies or academics, people who have tasks that they'd like done, linking them up with an online workforce, right? And oftentimes that work or those tasks are things like transcription or taking images. Tasks that humans tend to be pretty good at, but computers are not necessarily good at. But it turns out, one of the things you can pay this labor pool to do is to take surveys. And we now have at least one public pollster using this to do public opinion polling that's getting picked up and fed into the national news stream. So I think this raises some questions. As a methodologist, I have some questions about this. The first question, the one that we'd like to try to speak to with our study today, is about data quality. So in these opt-in polls, whether it be an online survey panel or this crowdsourcing type sample, are you getting good, accurate data? A second question, which is very important, but really not our focus today, is are estimates from those sample sources accurate? There's a lot of work that's focused in on that second question, and it's typically done through benchmarking or some exercise like that. We've done that at Pew Research Center. Other research teams have done it. It's important, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. Today, I'd like to focus on data quality and data security, frankly. Okay, so when we talk about data quality in surveys, that's a big topic. And one thing I want to be very clear on is that opt-in surveys, non-probability surveys, don't have a monopoly on low data quality, right? And by low data quality, usually we're talking about satisficing. And you could show me the best, most rigorous, expensive survey you could go out and do, and there's probably going to be some people in that sample who are satisficing, right? So by satisficing, we mean taking cognitive shortcuts, either kind of going quickly through the questionnaire to get it over with, just generally being inattentive. Those types of suboptimal behavior are satisficing. And there are hundreds of peer-reviewed articles in our journals that talk about satisficing. That's a very well studied, I think quite well understood topic in our field. What's new is this potential threat raised from opt-in sources, where you have people opting into the process. And the potential threat that we wanted to learn more about was really kind of out-and-out fraudulent interviews, especially ones that might be generated by bots. So what is a survey bot? Survey bots are computer programs that can complete online surveys quickly and at high volume, either in order to make money or potentially to affect the results. Now, if you have a algorithm, some program that's completing surveys for you, they're not going to make much money or anything, points or whatever it is for one survey. But you can imagine if you do it at a high volume, you might start to see some return that would make that whole enterprise worthwhile to some folks. So that's the concern. And I should also be clear, there's lots of bots. Survey bot is just one specific type of bot. Many bots are perfectly benign, not malicious. But survey bots are just kind of a subgroup within that we're interested in. And the thing that's really got my attention is there is zero peer-reviewed work on this topic, on this potential threat to our field. And so that's kind of the gap that we're looking to fill here. It's also the case that these things are commercially available. If you go on Google right now and look at survey bots, there's a commercially available product that's out there to do this very thing. And again, so while there's no rigorous survey projects we're aware of that have attempted to study this, there's lots of discussion, right? If you go out and talk to practitioners in the field, some of which are familiar, some of which less familiar, there are people talking about this, talking about the existence of bots already in survey panels and online survey sources. So you can see if you dig around online, a number of blog posts by practitioners that are talking about this issue. My colleagues and I at Pew Research Center, just anecdotally, have talked with folks who work at multiple online opt-in vendors, and they've acknowledged that yes, this is a thing. They exist in their panel, and it's a real threat. So there's a whole lot of smoke here, and we'd like to see, is there fire, and what's the nature of it? And to be a little more concrete, these are the research questions that we really have with this study. So, are there bots or other cases exhibiting bot-like behavior in national public opinion polls? Ones drawn from opt-in survey panels, from this sort of new crowdsourcing marketplace sample, or even from survey panels that are recruited offline using a probability-based procedure. And frankly, theoretically, there's no reason to expect that you'd have a bot in that last category of a probability-based recruited panel. But from a design perspective, I think there's merit in just testing that. And let's see whether or not there's anything that's really troubling in even what on paper look like, the more rigorously designed surveys that are now. So all of these are conducted online, and the nature of the sampling differs. And so we'd like to get a measure of the incidence level. And if we do find evidence, are these cases just adding noise? Are they answering at random? Or do they look systematically different than normal respondents? And finally, do kind of common data quality checks that a lot of practitioners are already using, do those prove effective in identifying any really troubling bot-like cases? Okay, so here's what we did. This spring, we went out and fielded a common survey on 6 different online survey platforms. We used 3 different online survey panels, each of which are used by public opinion pollsters, so these are common. We used 1 crowdsourcing marketplace website, probability-based panels. Both of those panels at this point are either solely or primarily address-based recruited. So we had these 6 different sample sources, and on each one we completed at least 10,000 interviews. And we felt strongly that having these large samples was important, because not only did we want to get precise, reliable estimates of any incidences, but we also wanted to be able to look at the characteristics of any suspicious information that was available when we were designing this. It was going to be low incidence, and so we wanted a large sample so that we could look at the characteristics. These were all national surveys. The target population was adults 18 and over. We administered in English and Spanish, and when we contracted to do this study, it was important that we're really trying to make inference to the types of opinion polls that are done using these platforms. So we specified that the style, the form, the sourcing is all normal for how polls are done. The analysis I'm going to show you today is all unweighted. We have some plans in subsequent analysis for using weights, but today is all unweighted. So let me say a little bit about what exactly the instrument looked like. The whole beginning of the survey was 44 questions total. The whole beginning was purposely designed and modeled after public opinion polls that use these opt-in sources. So question 1 was a right track, wrong track. Question 2 was presidential approval. That was followed by some more question, opinion, political. Beginning this survey, it should look and feel like just a normal public opinion survey. Later down in the instrument, we had a lot of questions that were written to feel like a public opinion poll, but in fact the intention was really purely methodological. And there were a mix of closed-ended questions and open-ended questions. And what we're going to focus on today, and what I think is one of the really new things that we've done here, is we administered open-ended questions, because we're trying to accomplish. If you limit yourself as a researcher to just closed-ended responses and you're trying to discern, an algorithm from a human, that's going to be very unsatisfying and very difficult. So we thought, well, let's do a lot of open-ended questions, because that seems like a sterner test for something automated to try to fake and be convincing as a human. So we did a number of these, and they're designed to be, not hard open-ended questions. Easy. They're designed to be, basically relevant to anyone you might, meet on the street. So we asked, how would you say you're feeling today? When you were growing up, what big city was closest to where you live? When you visit a new city, what kind of activities do you like to do? What would you like to do in retirement? A question about how do you know when it's time to replace your computer? And finally, what would you like to see elected leaders in Washington get done during the next few years? Please give as much detail as you can. So what we're looking for is to get the richness of responses to these data. And what we figured would be the most interesting thing we might find is an answer that's basically a non sequitur, right? So if I ask you, how are you feeling today? And you say yes, Or if I ask you, what would you like to do in retirement? And you say, see you tonight, that's completely unresponsive, right, to what I just asked you. Those are non sequitur answers. And we think, like, if we were to find that, that would raise some flags, right? That would be indicative, maybe not definitive, but certainly indicative of something suspicious going on. So that is one of the main, sort of designed things that we're going to be looking at in the data. And then there were a number of closed-ended measurements that we had to try to identify problematic response and probably low data quality. And these are, right? This notion that if you ask a question about a fake thing and people say that, oh yeah, I've heard of that, or I do that, that's error, because it's impossible that they were actually doing that behavior. So we had a question, we asked about different websites. Which of these websites do you use? Some of them were real, like Facebook or Instagram, and others were completely fictitious. And then there was something very similar in spirit. We wanted to ask about a news story. It felt irresponsible to up like just a fake news story, so we did the next closest thing, which was identify a real news story that was just incredibly obscure. So there was something that happened in China last fall about their law enforcement laws, and China's revised criminal procedure law. There was like one wire story back in October about this, and as far as we could tell, no national U.S. dialogue. So if somebody told us that, oh, I'm following that story very closely, that's like highly unlikely to be true. We also asked a pretty standard attention check. So to the extent that people in the field who use these sources are trying to check for data, probably the main thing that they're doing are these trap questions or attention check questions, which is a question that says something like, it's important to read questions carefully. If you're reading this, please select X below. And in our case, it was choose the color silver below. So we administered one of those. And the last closed-ended measurement we did, we asked people, where are you currently living? And the first punch was outside the United States, and the bottom punch was inside the United States. And if someone told us they live outside the United States, that's also error, because our target population is people in the United States. So we have a number of things going on. Okay, like I said, the thrust of what I'm going to talk about today, what was really quite interesting to us, were the open-ended data. So it was a lot of data. I mentioned 6 online sources, 10,000 interviews each, led to over 375 answers. And we've manually coded. You know what I've been doing the last few weeks now. 5 things. Either a responsive, oh, I don't want to say, refusal in nature, either just letters or numbers or a concept. The most interesting one, right? This is where our attention. It's a text answer. It's coherent, but it doesn't fit. Finally, just when the answer field was left blank, we had I don't know if any of you work. If you do, they're just grammatical errors, and in writing, it's not unique to survey respondents. To the extent that the coder could decipher what the person was trying to do, if it was indeed on. Even if they, I asked, what activities do you like to do? And you say, no. Even coded that as responsive. Even though those types of, from a substantive standpoint, that's an answer that a real human might give, even though we think is a very generous, very permissive definition of responsive to the question. If it was like remotely in the ballpark, we gave it the benefit of the doubt. Okay, in a few minutes, I'm going to break out what we found by the 6 different sources. But to really explain what we found, I want to start by walking you through the data. And one thing I have to, just get out and make clear right off the bat is the vast majority of the open-ended answers we got back were responsive. So across like all of the questions and all the samples, about 93% of those answers we coded as responsive to the question. So just keep that in mind. And so what did that look like? If we asked people, how are you feeling today? We got great stuff. My tattoo itches. I'm going to a fish fry with my girlfriend. I'd like to have a beer with all of these people. Fabulous. Mostly it was this. Mostly it's very rich, beautiful, real people giving you real stuff. It was like that for all 6 questions, right? If you ask people what they want folks in Washington to get done, you get what you'd expect. Ban guns, build the wall, fix healthcare. You get all that. Visit a new city, walk around. I don't like cities. Historical things, Okay. Those are all real answers. You get the picture. All right, so what about that next code, gibberish? There was definitely some gibberish. There just wasn't a lot of it. This was a code that was really pretty rarely used. When we did see gibberish, this is like exactly what it looked like. Okay, so I won't belabor it with a lot of examples. Once we, got into this study and thought about it, we're inclined to think that gibberish is probably just human satisficing. That's a guess on our part. We do not know for sure. But it seems like probably the most plausible explanation. And one thing that we didn't sort of expect but have observed is that if you're looking at the gibberish responses, they often feature prominently or even start with the letters F, G, or H, which if you know your QWERTY keyboard are right in the middle. So that we're going to test that and quantify that. But if that bears out, which I'm almost certain it will, just having seen the data, that lends some credibility to this perhaps being just human satisficing, because if it's in the middle of the keyboard, it's slightly less effort for a human. It would make no difference to an algorithm, right? So that's something that we saw there. All right, and now we get to the really interesting bucket of data. Not only did we find non sequitur answers, the thing that was really striking is we found very clear subgroups, very clear types of non sequitur data within that bucket. And I'll walk you through each of the types from sort of most banal to the most alarming. All right, so the first bucket of non sequitur answers were just like common words that were completely unresponsive. So this question, when you visit a city, what do you like to do? A lot of like, yes, no, happy, gracias, completely unresponsive, but they're just like common words. And so we'd get multiple of these to each of the 6 questions. The next subgroup of non sequiturs, which we didn't at all expect, were answers that sounded like snippets of a conversation. So same question, what do you do in a new city? What activities? We got this. I'll meet the seller. Please hang in there. Thank you for the update. So, each of these is a separate answer from a separate just really off-the-wall stuff. And one pattern we noticed is that not always, but often, you'd see repeated text in these types of answers. And, to be honest, at this point, we don't know exactly what's going on. We're sort of thinking about, is this a predictive text model at play? Whether it's like there's a human in control or an algorithm that's in control, I don't know. Is it sort of autofill? That seems like that may give us some insight to how this happened. These are just more examples from that same question. And we got these snippets of conversation type answers to all 6 of the open ends. So how are you feeling today? We got more of this, I'll text you tonight kind of stuff. So there was, there was a fair amount of this, and the interesting thing is all kind of different. We didn't see, all of these were sort of their own unique snowflakes, which is remarkable. All right, so the third bucket of non sequitur answers that we found are answers that sort of only make sense if whomever or whatever was in control thought they were reviewing a product. So what do you want to see people in Washington get done? We got this. Lots of it. And you just have to ask, you're like, how did this get into a public opinion poll? What's going on here? And we got that, we really got this to all 6 of the questions. Okay. And I skipped ahead too far. The coup de grace was this final subgroup within the non sequiturs. So we asked people, what would you like to see elected leaders in Washington get done? And we got George Washington's biography once. And we didn't get the same biography. We got it over and over and over and over and over. John Adams got a lot of love. The balcony that Washington walked out on got a lot of love. More John Adams. George Clinton was a historical figure, apparently. So I'm just giving you, this is not exhaustive, right? I could go on and on and on. I'm just giving you some illustrative examples. So it didn't take us long to think, well, maybe there's some sort, maybe a search engine is factoring into how this stuff is getting generated. And sure enough, you plop our question into Google, and the top 2 hits are the Mount Vernon website. So not only that, but it's fairly easy to track the exact place on these websites where these passages were pulled from. And again, I'll just give you some illustrations. This one pulled from Wikipedia. This one pulled from history.com. I could go on and on. And you'll see the third hit on Google for this question was the state of Washington legislature. You open up our data set, we got some of that. Long passages about appointments and judgeships and on and on. And you can see the exact passage where that stuff was pulled from. So, maybe you're in a generous mood and you're thinking, well, perhaps some of these guys were real humans who just aren't into politics and maybe needed some help answering a political question. They just wanted to do a really good job. But surely for how are you doing today? That wasn't necessary, right? Just a simple question, but on how are you feeling today? The same sort of thing. Here, we got these, clearly just bizarre answers, and some of them were pulled from these chat rooms. I don't know how they found them, but there's an example of that. This one pulled from a different chat room. This one pulled from something from Psychology Today. And all 6 open ends, we found multiple instances of this phenomenon. And again, it wasn't just one interview or a small handful of interviews doing this. One thing we saw in the data, we kept seeing this language to this new city question. Virtual tourist members agree, blah, blah, blah. It sounds really commercial and weird. And so we were tracking down where that came from. If you look in our survey data set, where each row is an interview, so we tracked down the source. That wasn't hard. This is our data set. This is how many people gave us that exact same passage from that exact same website. Wow. And so, one of the patterns of the data is you see this over and over repeated use of pulling from these same websites, whether it's Mount Vernon or the Washington State Legislature. Another interesting characteristic, you'd think, well, maybe if it's a human, they just grab a consecutive passage. And sometimes that was the case, often that was the case, but other times you saw it grabbed from 3 different parts of the website, the top, the middle, and the bottom. And very often, those different passages were joined with an ellipse. So all the ellipses, all the black text is original to the answer that was given to us. It's just the red is me. I'm trying to draw your attention. But those ellipses were in the original text, and you see that again and again, different interviews. Here's another example that pulled from the top of the site and way down below. So we saw multiple, different parts of a website, and you might also think, well, if there's a human involved, it would sort of be consecutive, right? But we found instances where, like, so take this answer. It's got sort of two different pieces, if you will, and they're in this order in our data set. If you track it to the original website, they're in the reverse order. No idea how that happened, but here's another example where there's sort of an answer with two pieces, and you go back to the original website, and it's in a different order. Huh. And finally, there's one answer, at least we found so far, that was pulled from two different websites, two different BuzzFeed articles to try to cobble together an answer about, a big city. So, and then, just to literally got caught is one of the answers. And then one interview for all 6 open ends, we got this weird, like, file path name 6 times. So that was a little suspicious. Okay, so there were just a number, like, endless surprises in this study so far. And one of them really was just how egregious the bad behavior was. My team and I, when we designed this, we walked into it fully expected that this distinction between a satisficer and maybe some automated process would be incredibly gray. We wouldn't be able to say anything definitive at all. It'd be really murky, and we'd just do our best to triangulate. And I think that kind of got blown up once we started looking at the data and saw some of the patterns that we saw. One other takeaway is, so we had the 6 open ends. One of them happened to be way more effective at catching this phenomenon of, like, plagiarism from the internet. And it was the question that had the word Washington in it. And by virtue of hindsight, well, okay, Washington has 3 common meanings, between the president, the capital, and the state, and that seemed to really trip up again and again whatever was trying to sort of game this process. So I think that there's a huge lesson to be learned there. But I do have to come back to where I started in terms of the incidence of this stuff. It was rare, okay? So let me show you what that all looked like. This is the most simplistic way you could look at the data. I just took all the answers from each of the sources and are showing you the distribution of those codes. So this ignores the fact that the 6 questions are nested within respondents, right? I'll get to that in a second. But just to give you a very straightforward view, the vast majority of responses, again, were responsive. And the probability-based panels, by and large, looked reasonable in what you'd expect. I would have to say, though, like, they had fairly high item non-response rates in terms of decays and items left blank. So I think it's fair to look at that and be like, well, that's a limitation. That's a data quality flaw. It is. But it's also not one that's particularly concerning for me because, frankly, the people in both of these panels are told again and again at the start of a survey, you do not have to answer every question. You're free to skip a question you do not want to answer. So those panelists are conditioned to be able to skip questions, and some of them take us up on that. You can contrast that with the opt-in folks, who I think the norm there is more you're required to answer the questions, maybe not all the time, but often there's a requirement to answer everything. So maybe not shocking that you see differences in terms of item non-response. But the most interesting one, right, is this non sequitur behavior. And that definitely was more prevalent, about 8 times more prevalent in the opt-in sources than the probability-based sources, although not 0. There were some probability-based respondents who gave a few non sequitur answers. And, you have to recognize that the overall levels are on the low side. We're talking, single digits here. All right, and I want to break out that sort of final behavior of this plagiarism from across the internet. A couple of things to note. In total, there were 395 instances we found so far that we've, cleared dead to rights what was going on. That behavior was really, really concentrated in the crowdsourced sample. We found just a few instances in some of the online opt-in panels, but 96% of those answers came from that crowdsourced sample, and literally 0 came from the probability-based All right, so now I want to address this issue of the base and just rebase it for you. So we're talking about interviews or respondents and not answers. But in order to do that, we have to take 6 questions worth of open-ended codes and sort of combine them. So we took those data and for each respondent, coded them as one of these things. So the top row are kind of the squeaky clean guys. No repeated problems in their open-ended data. The next row are people that may have that skipped 2 or more questions. The middle row are the people that gave us multiple gibberish, then people gave us multiple non sequiturs, and finally cases that gave us an answer where it was clearly plagiarized. And there's really not much to see here. You get really the same portrait, the same picture if you base it on interviews, right? You get these single digits of the most egregious behavior in the opt-in sources, and really only very low trace levels in the probability-based sources. And it ranges from about 2 to 4% of the respondents in those opt-in sources giving that like really alarming data in the open end. All right, so now I want to turn to this really important question, which is, okay, we found some really concerning data. Is it just noise, or are these guys different, systematically different? Are they different politically? So the second question, as I said, was presidential approval. And if you're paying attention to polling, you know that Trump's approval rating is about 40%, right? Depending on what poll exactly you're looking at, it's either in the very high 30s or it's in the low 40s. And this is exactly what we found. So here I'm collapsing all the sources and just looking at by the sort of type of open-ended behavior. Among the vast majority of people who gave us reasonable open-ended data, you get what you'd expect. Trump's approval is right around 40%. It was 39 unweighted. What about the cases that gave us some, that looked okay, but they gave us some item non-response? They looked highly similar, frankly, to the other cases. What about those who gave us gibberish? Trump's approval rating was 58% among people that gave us gibberish, which is on the high side. How about the non sequiturs? It was 69% among people that gave us multiple non sequitur answers. In the cases where we tracked them to a website, the approval rating was 95%. And here's where it gets weird. We also asked about Obamacare approval or disapprove. Approval of Obamacare was 97%. And if you've been following politics, this does not exist in real life. This idea that you have people who are like staunch Trump supporters and staunch Obamacare supporters. So there is systematic behavior going on here, but it is politically incoherent. Okay? And so that's and you can predict it based on the open-ended behavior. When my team and I, looked at this, we thought, oh, well, it's just a privacy effect, right? All you're seeing is, okay, you've got these cases you've identified that are giving you terrible data. When they get to the closed-ended, they must simply be just checking the first box every time. So they're going to always approve whatever is first. That's not the case. We asked a question where the question was, do you currently live? This first punch was outside the U.S. The second punch was inside the U.S. And almost all of these guys, even the weird open-ended guys, largely passed that test. So it's not merely this rote program of selecting the first answer. And even if you dig into that 95% Trump approval rating, there's a lot of folks in that 95 number that actually it said somewhat approved, right? So it was a combination of both first punch and second punch behavior that went into that 95% approval rating. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to have time to apologize, I'll probably go a little bit long today. The last thing I just want to touch on is how do these closed-ended behaviors relate to, how do the open-ended behaviors I talked about relate to the closed-ended checks that we administered? And one of the checks, as I said, was asking about completely, fictitious things. If somebody says they're doing this, they're lying. It's not possible. And we did see that it worked to some extent. So, in the teens, we got folks who were giving us gibberish or non sequiturs, told us that they use these websites, which was impossible. and very, very low levels of folks who gave us the good open-ended behavior said that same thing. But again, that certainly didn't catch all of the really suspicious cases that we had here. And then there was the question that was about the news story. And that did, kind of trip up a lot of people who were giving us suspect data. But there also seems to be a lot of false positives going on here. People maybe just wanted to portray themselves as being attentive to the news. So, there's a relationship there, but is it a silver bullet? It doesn't, no, I wouldn't say it is. And finally, there's the traditional attention check, the trap question that a lot of people in the field are relying on to try to catch this thing. 97% of the plagiarized answer type cases passed the attention check, which I'll be honest, floored us. I mean, it's like, how is this happening? How are we getting just garbage in one part of the survey, and yet they figure this one out, and they figure out the inside outside the United States. So again, I think the main takeaway at this point is just we don't have a silver bullet. I mean, yeah, it tripped up some of the people where they gave us kind of really bizarre data, but it certainly didn't catch all of them. So I'll try to wrap up here. What we've learned so far. The closed-ended trap, I would say, is not enough, with 97% of the plagiarizing cases passing that test. One thing I think is really important that I'll hope to flesh out in other reporting is in one respect, we replicated what a lot of other researchers have found. If you do the easy stuff, break-offs, speeders, a lot of the data quality checks you see in the literature for satisficing, we did those. I don't have time to present those, but we did that stuff. And yeah, if you look at who's speeding and breaking off, they don't look any different. They're not that interesting. They're kind of like everybody else. But I think that's given the field a completely false sense of assurance. Because if you actually do something hard, if you do open-ended questions and you code those up carefully, the open end is where we saw both really suspicious data and people who were distinct politically. They weren't coherent politically, and maybe there was no intention. But I think it's important to point out that whatever the intention was, the effect is like uniform Trump approval and uniform approval of whatever the pollster was trying to study. And again, I need to emphasize that what incidences are we talking about here? With the opt-in sources, we're talking about 2 to 4% of that really highly suspicious data is what we found. And that does limit the magnitude and the threat to survey estimates conducted using these sources. It was also really interesting that the nature of the problematic data from that crowdsourced marketplace sample was qualitatively different than the chicanery in the normal opt-in samples. The crowdsourced sample is where we saw the plagiarism. And the normal opt-in survey samples is where we saw that like weird conversational stuff that looked like maybe an autofill. In some of the other non sequiturs. So that there was a real difference going on between those types of opt-in samples. And in terms of the probability-based data that were in the mix, to my eye, that largely went as expected. There was some non sequitur answers, but very, very little. No plagiarism that we've found thus far. If we did see high item non-response rates, it's fair to criticize that, but I wouldn't characterize that as like really alarming or malicious. So I just wanted to note that this isn't done right. We're going to be doing reliability metrics are in the works, variance estimates, significance testing, all that stuff's coming. Apologies, I didn't have time for this version. And the last note that I want to end on, if we think about future research, is to go back to this issue of how did we get here? What really cracked the nut for us on this study was that question that had Washington with the 3 meetings tripping up the open, whatever procedure is in place. So like, I might have seen a glimpse at the future of survey research, and it's like, it's Sting from the Police in a bee, where it's homonyms. I think that this is something that as a field, if we're going to continue to use these sources, that we might want to exploit. So thank you very much.
We've got 10, 15 minutes worth of questions, and I can see hands are flying as we go. So, Courtney, I'll let you take them over.
Stephanie, you were probably first.
Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, this was fascinating. Very nice work. Super impressive. I wondered if you had yet, or if you've thought about coming at it from the other direction. You downloaded that, you showed that screenshot of the bot, and I went and found it on my phone, and I just want to play with it. Have you done it that way? Like found the bots and played with them and see like what kind of answers do they generate to these kinds of questions?
That's a great question. Our teams joked about like we're gonna like download the bot and just like have a virus spread across the entire center. We have not done that yet. That's a perfectly reasonable suggestion. I don't know if we're going to do it, if we're the research team that's going to go really far down that rabbit hole. I mean, on one level, it does feel kind of skeezy. Like, this is terrible. There's a product out there to game surveys and create fraudulent data. But I agree that there is intellectual and scientific merit to studying that and looking at those types of things.
I mean, we want to see what they want to do, but they also are going to like evolve very quickly once we figure it out, right? They're going to evolve into something different.
That's the thing, and it's one thing I should have said, that there's a lot of stuff we learned that if the next research team designs for what we did, it could be that the bots are one step ahead of us forever, right? So we just have to be aware that I think it's important to pay attention to the principles that might be bot proof, but there's a lot of the details that a bot could learn. Like, for example, we were so permissive. Anytime someone was like, whatever, nothing, I don't care, like we were really permissive. And so if you trained a bot to give just kind of like lame answers, you would have looked great in this study. So there's a lot of tricks, and so there's total merit. I can't guarantee we're going to be the ones to do that. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, so when you get to the interview level and you have those distributions, you probably have a time factor, and it would be very interesting to go to the gibberish and see if they're faster. You know, I'd be curious. Did you do that analysis? Do you have anything on that? Because that would
you mean in terms of completion of the survey time?
Yes.
That's so. Yeah, crossing the different flags is something that we've started to look at. We haven't done it exhaustively. My initial look at the timings is kind of what I alluded to earlier. It didn't seem that interesting in terms of the strength of the association between some of the flags and speeding or breakoffs. But admittedly, I was more focused on the non sequiturs, and you raised the point of the gibberish. There could be a strong relationship there, and we just have not had time to turn to it yet. And I would also say too, I feel really strongly we're going to make this data set public. There's no way that my team's going to be able to completely tap all the interesting findings that should be studied from this. So we hope that others avail themselves to it. Sure.
One of those non sequiturs reminded me of problems I have with my iPhone, where it's picking up stuff that I'm saying instead of what I'm writing when I don't think I even have that facility turned on to a phone. Could that possibly be the source of some of that stuff that you're saying?
Could it be? As far as we know, it could be. We don't have any definitive answers about what was the process in place. The idea of autofill and some of those assistive built-in procedures that are on smartphones seem like probably the most likely suspects, in our opinion. I'm not sure we'll ever be able to say something definitive, but it seems highly likely and plausible. So I definitely agree.
Did you look at where in the survey a question was asked in terms of what kinds of open-ended responses you got? Because I've found that on his speeding question, for example, several years ago when I was in the private sector, that people figured out that speeding was going to get them no money, and so they started slowing down. What I've found is that it seems like now they all expect after you're done with the survey, you're going to get kicked back to your panel company where they're going to ask you about the survey you just took, because they do these little meta-analysis to see whether or not the polls, the surveys that are being taken are overly burdensome to the respondents. And so when I have the open-ended question that I use to term people as my last question, they respond to it as though they're being asked about the survey.
Yes.
So it seems like they're getting smart enough to know where it is in the survey and using that as a determinant for how it is that they pipe in their random text.
So we definitely got multiple answers that said something like, great survey. I love this survey, which I think is very it wasn't that fun.
Or it was easy. Or
so we definitely got that. It was not at sort of the level and the magnitude that I thought to make a slide about it, but it's in there. in terms of like differences across the survey, for the 6 items were pretty spread out. They all returned pretty similar data, I would say, except for the Washington thing, which I really focused in on. That was just, kind of qualitatively different in tripping up people with the multiple meetings. But in terms of, the type of data we got back from the 5 other open ends, my recollection is it was really quite similar in terms of the types of stuff that we got. But we could look more at that. Yeah, we've not thought to look at it through that lens, so it could be there's stuff there that we just haven't found. Nancy.
So 2 questions for you. First of all, are vendors who are, let's say, giving you opt-in data, are they doing anything like this routinely? Are they putting in any kind of trap questions or open-ended to try and tell their clients, don't worry, we're filtering this stuff out?
That's a great question. And I don't have a comprehensive answer at this point. So, but it really speaks to sort of some of the inference that we're trying to make here. Are the public opinion pollsters or other clients routinely doing this thing? So we do have some bits of information. If you look at the methodology statements of at least the pollsters using these, there's no discussion that I've seen of the data quality checks that are in place. It could be they're doing them and they just elect not to mention that they are doing data quality checks, but from the public record, it would appear not. And in terms of, what are the vendors doing? My impression is that there is a lot of variance, that some vendors who are just kind of like the retail, if you will, where they're just supplying bodies and they really don't do the design in the front and the back end of surveys, but they're just supplying the bodies. I don't think that they really engage that at all. I could be wrong, but that's my impression. And then you contrast that with vendors that, a lot of us work with that have, trained methodologists on staff that think carefully about design, think about weighting. And we do know from our own experience that they can flag this type of stuff and say, in this literalist study, no one at the front end on the vendor side said to us, you should do A, B, or C. The entire instrument came from us, traps and all. But once the data set was collected, before it was delivered to us, the main vendor we were working with, which is a credible, quite rigorous one, they said, well, we noticed a lot of people skipped a lot of questions. We noticed a lot of people failed the attention check. We would recommend dropping these 1,000 cases. Will you let us do that? And I said, no. But when we write this up, we have to address that issue in a very clear way. And I don't know, Jake, if you agree, but my impression is the answer is there's real variance depending on whether you're dealing with a full service vendor, in which case they probably engage those issues at least a little bit, versus the vendors that are just selling bodies, if you will, that you can really do whatever you want. Yeah.
My question was basically going to be, did you flag everybody who you eliminated? And if you did the panel companies you were working with ask for those flags? And if so, did they ask for the reasoning for the flags? So like the ones that I work with now, I supply the reason why I eliminated them. And I give the full list of arrest IDs that I kicked out.
Yep.
And then I have columns for this person was like an ultra speeder across the line through, they failed the open-ended trap. And then I use a combination of multiple, so I don't use any one of them. But
yes. So we have those data. The bottom line is we've not kicked anybody out. So all these 62,000 plus responses are really all the cases, all of the cases that we got, from the vendor. So.
But did they ask? Like, did the vendor say, if you offered them, did they ask you to see whether or not you had low quality data? And if so, did they ask? Because I've sort of pushed them in that direction of like, here's the people we're not going to pay for because they weren't quality data,
right?
And here's why. And what they say is they're going to bring them back to their quality control experts, which I've taken to mean we're going to include them, we're going to keep them in our user database so that our number is still big, but we're going to remove them from our active user database, which is actually the smaller number.
Well, we're at least we're not in a long-term relationship with the opt-in vendors, so we don't have that kind of dialogue and relationship. But it's a reasonable suggestion. Ken.
To me, the most troubling finding was the attention result in conjunction with the Trump approval and Obama, which suggests a high level of sophistication in these bots that appears that whoever's purchasing them aren't modifying, but that's really troubling because they do appear very intelligent, and without a number of additional questions as you had, I'm not sure how we would find these in a survey without adding additional questions that may affect response rate, especially for panels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. It was, one of the findings and the learnings from this study was that those cases even existed, that it was possible to see really bizarre answers to an open end, and yet this sort of something strategic going on, some sentient, I don't know what, navigated the trap questions about inside, outside the U.S. and the attention check. So I completely agree. We're in the process of thinking through what does this all mean? And one thing this might mean is that if in fact you really want to make sure, do the best possible job, that you don't have these crazy cases, maybe you just have to ask an open end and do some serious coding. And maybe there is not a simple fix. Maybe it's not a good idea for pollsters to be, we're going to turn it around in 24 hours and get the data. Maybe it's not, maybe if you actually want good data, it takes more time and it takes more effort, and there's such a pull for this to be quick and easy. But quick and easy, we're seeing, has some drawbacks at a low incidence, but I think that's, one of my takeaways from this. Yes, Craig?
Just think about embedding a CAPTCHA
question,
or do any of online vendors
So, in doing some lit review on this study, I learned that CAPTCHA's been broken, and the code to break CAPTCHA has been published in Science. Or Nature, one of the two, I can't remember. It's fair to say that that doesn't mean CAPTCHA would be completely ineffective. It's still in use, but because it's been broken, and we do see the sophistication. We learned about the sophistication after the fact, but I'm just not clear it's like a long-term solution. And it does raise questions about, we'd be a little leery of doing CAPTCHA on our own panel. But anything we administered here, we felt obliged to administer the same test of our own guys. And so it's like, we didn't want them to feel a little too weirded out. So it's a good suggestion, but I think there are some drawbacks there. Not sure it's sort of what either. Yeah.
Did you have any estimates of basically lame responses, the whatevers, that could be human but also could not be human?
That's a great question. We've not done that, and I think that would be worth doing. I'm not sure if my team will have the bandwidth, but I hope somebody does it. Because when I was talking with my colleague Scott about this, he's like, well, what about the false negatives? How many false negatives do you think are in these data? And that's what they are. I shouldn't say that's what they are. That's what they could be. That could be the nature. There could be false negatives that just said good or yes or, did that. Or again, gave kind of a lame whatever. And so I think it is worth someone going back in and implementing a less permissive coding scheme, frankly, and being a little more strict and having higher standards about that and seeing if that changes the conclusions or not. So I don't know at this point. Sir, yeah.
If you were focusing on the open-ended questions, have you thought of doing anything like statistical algorithms on categorical or closed-end questions to try to identify them that way?
No, not yet. We've talked about throwing all of the closed-ended data, I'm looking at Andrew, into maybe some sort of clustering model to see if there's patterns in the closed-ended text. But you're right, you could do a similar in spirit exercise with with open-ended text. You could do something similar in spirit with the closed-ended. We've not done that yet, but it's a good suggestion. I suspect you'd see patterns. What we see here, there's a lot of patterns. A lot of them are unpredictable, but there seem to be some patterns there. So yeah, it's a good idea. Nancy.
So I think you kind of alluded to this in one of your last slides, and maybe you just haven't gotten there yet. But it seems like the good news is that, first of all, it's not super widespread. you did see huge distribution differences among the most egregious sort of bots. But let's say I don't have a great vendor who's going to throw those out. Once you leave them in, is it skewing your overall approval or who approves Obamacare? How much is it screwing up sort of the estimates to leave those in there?
Sure. So the worst case that we have is that about 2% of that crowdsourced marketplace panel. So 2% was like the very egregious behavior. 2% is not a lot. The problem is it was a nearly uniform answer to Trump approval.
Right.
So 2 points. And maybe if with sampling error, in some instances it might be more. So that's kind of the magnitude. With the opt-in guys, maybe a little less than that, because it was slightly less uniform, and overall the incidences were a little bit over. But again, that's sort of assuming that there aren't a lot of these false positives lurking in the data that we just haven't found yet. But I think it's kind of on that magnitude, and depending on what you're doing, 2 points may or may not matter in these close elections. It's the kind of thing I agonize over, so I would deem that important for some of these applications. But yeah.
That's part of your question, talking about if the vendor doesn't clean these up. At this stage, I don't know that I would want a vendor to do the cleaning until much more is known.
Sure, yeah.
I think like you don't clean those.
Right.
We want to see them.
Yeah.
Were you provided any, call it paradata, on these respondents to get patterns that are kind of tangential to the actual survey? I was thinking time of day, some type of clustering, ISP information.
We don't have ISP information. And, if you look at the literature that does exist, which is not in our journals, but some other, kind of scattered, people try to trap down ISPs. And the thing is, those can be faked as well. And we're not equipped and tech enough to sort of figure out faked IPs and all kind of that. So I don't think that we'd go there. We've not really plumbed the paradata, I would say. One thing I really do want to do, haven't had time to do yet, is to look at the field period and see if there's a relationship as to whether all the really egregious stuff is happening very early. Like if they've just gamed this system so much that they're like the first ones in the gate, that might be useful information, But I don't know if that relationship's there. We'll look into that. That's a good question.
Got time for a couple more questions?
Just really exciting research. I'm sort of curious about how you pulled it off, like how you got the funding together and how you the coders, quite a challenge.
Really embarrassing answers. So there's way too many PhDs that are coding, manual coding. The funding, I have to thank, he's in the room, Michael Dimmick, president of the Pew Research Center. I sat down with Michael multiple times. I said, here's kind of what I'm thinking. And I just had to make the argument. I was like, Mike, this is a threat to the field, right? And maybe it's not our polls, but they're polls that matter. They're polls that are going to get talked about every night on the news. Like, this matters. This is what we care deeply about at Pew. And there's no good research. Whatever we do in this space is going to be a contribution. And Mike gets that, right? The Pew Research Center leadership really feels passionately about this. So the funding required to do this was substantial. It's not peanuts. And obviously what really put it over the edge were the probability-based samples. So you do 10,000 cases on two, pretty high quality offline recruited samples. It's substantial funds. It just happened to work out that we did have funding available, and the passion and the desire to fill this research gap was there. In terms of the coding, I'm obviously passionate about this project. Even though it's a little insane, I manually went through all of the open-ended answers.
Gosh.
But as I explained to people, the whole point of this study was to get into the richness of the open-ended data. And at one point, somebody's like, well, why don't we just have a model code? And I'm like, Don't suggest to me that you have an algorithm, try to find another algorithm. Like, that is, I'm not going to do that. You know, this is about sort of the really hard task of like this Turing test. What's human, what's not, right? And trying to learn interesting patterns that as a field we've never even observed before. And so, yeah, it was a total pain in the butt, but it was like so worth it. And, and all of my colleagues who, you know, are insanely overqualified for this task have joined me in coding up the open ends. I'm going to pull up their names. So like Andrew, Scott, Arnold, Nick Hatley, the entire methodology team. We've, you know, done random subsampling and stratified and
You didn't crowdsource it.
We were going to use the crowdsource marketplace website to do the coding. I swear to God. And I got partway through the data, and I said to the team, I said, we cannot do that. I'm not going to get up in front of like WSS and say like, we found all these bots, and then we used I'm not doing that. So yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, I keep thinking it's like Alice in Wonderland time. You know, it's like, what is going on, and how do you even begin to wrap your head around this stuff?
All right. With that, any additional questions? I encourage you to follow us for dinner, and please let Courtney be able to eat because obviously she's exhausted after doing all this coding. But again, thank you, congratulations, and